All right. So just to give you guys a little brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today, Realist is actually where we have all of the tax record information being imported from the county assessor's offices. Now, this means that we're actually going to be getting all of the data for all 77 counties in Oklahoma, and we're also going to be making available to you guys the 7 neighboring counties over in Arkansas as well. So since we do have a lot of members that are over on the eastern half of the state, or excuse me, the eastern edge of the state, um, there's going to be a few people that might be working with, Fort Smith, Siloam Springs. We don't want you guys to feel like you have to use a completely different system just to be able to get that tax record information. So we've made that available in Realist as well. I did want to mention that Matrix and Realist do have a lot of interconnectivity. We're going to be discussing some of the connected elements as we go through this, but I did want to point out, if you guys are signed into Matrix, Matrix will have a link up at the top of the page that simply says Realist Tax. This brings you to the same interface that the link on your MLS portal provides you. So it should just bring you over into Realist automatically. If you're looking at a particular listing, so for instance, if I had, let's do, how about this one? This one's got some results. If I'm looking at an individual listing, underneath the photos of the listing, there will be 3 black icons. All 3 of these icons go to somewhere in Realist. So the tax lookup is just going to give us some basic information about the property, just going through the property details. The M is going to bring us to the map. This is actually going to show us where this particular property is on the map, so that way you don't have to do too much searching. And all this information, again, is being provided by the county assessor's office, so the mapping should be correct. If you do notice any inconsistencies, though, please make sure that you provide that to us. We can get in contact with our Realist liaison. I'll mention that a couple more times as well. And then finally, there's the neighborhood report. So all of the listings in our system should be connected to that information in Realist. Now, depending on how the agent had originally set up the listing, you may notice that those aren't connected to the right property. It doesn't happen too often, but the easiest way to head that off is to always put in your tax parcel number on every single listing you enter into Matrix. So, which is something that we recommend when we're talking about Matrix and also in our add edit class. But again, just as a reminder, it would be a good idea to always include the tax ID whenever you're actually entering a listing into our system. All right. So we're going to be spending a huge amount of our class talking about Realist. The very first things that we actually need to discuss is going to be this home page. Now, for those of you guys who have been working in Realist for a while, you may have noticed that the interface actually changed last year. For a long time, we actually had the Realist system running through something called Flash. As of December last year, the group that was actually responsible for updating and maintaining Flash actually decided that they were going to get rid of it. There was a lot of other products that were either doing similar functions or far and away more functions and more efficiently and so on and so forth. So it was time. It had become a little bit dilapidated. But now that we have the new interface, things are going to be a little bit more streamlined. So right here at the very beginning, when we first get onto this page, again, this is just our default home page. If I have made any modifications to my look, those would be reflected each time I sign in. So for instance, if we had changed whether we were looking at the map view or the list view, that's what it'll start with. If we had the search function collapsed, it may be collapsed whenever you get back into it. But what we're looking at here is actually the default. Now on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a quick search function. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about quick search, and then we're going to spend the majority of our class discussing the My Search functions. We've got a map, which has a bunch of tools up at the top. We'll be covering that in the second half of our class. And we've got our results that would appear right down here. This interface that we have down here at the bottom is actually going to be pretty much the same interface that you guys would be seeing whenever you're doing a search and finding results in Matrix as well. So not to worry, we'll be discussing all of this. Now, I did want to give you guys a little heads up on what the class is going to be like. Since this is a 2-hour long class, we're going to actually take a break here around the top of the hour. So around 2, we should end up having a little break, and then we'll come back and finish the remainder of the class then. So now that we've got that intro out of the way, let's start talking about some of the more practical elements. When you first get into Realist, it's going to automatically have a county chosen. More than likely, you guys have probably got Tulsa County chosen. Not to worry, we do have the option to change that. And in fact, if you guys are going to be working in a different county, that's the first thing that you'll want to do. So right up here at the top, we've got a button here for Change County. When I click on Change County, it's going to come up with an interface that we're going to see similarly mirrored on a lot of other functions. So you notice over here on the left, we have a categories section. This shows us all the different states that we have available. So we've got Oklahoma. All of Oklahoma is in here. You can see we've got all 77 counties. And again, we've got all 7 counties neighboring us right across the border for Arkansas as well. Now, one notable thing to mention, we do have a Washington County that's in Arkansas, and we also have at the very bottom here, Washington County, Oklahoma. So it's important to remember that there's these categories over on the left-hand side, because if I am trying to get some properties found in Bartlesville, I'm going to have to make sure that I choose the correct county down here at the bottom. Make sure that you see that little OK indicating what state you're in. So I check my checkbox, and it adds it to my list over here on the right. Now, another important element that we're going to see a lot of here in Realist is that there is a limit to how many counties you can choose. And you're going to see this little limiter in a lot of other places. So I'll keep pointing that out, but this is the first time we're coming across it. So I'll just make sure to mention that. I also wanted to point out that if we do end up checking enough of these checkboxes, it will actually prevent you from adding more. It'll give you a little red indicator. And over here on the right, we can actually see all of the all the counties that we've chosen. So if there is any county that we're no longer working with, or if I just happen to be searching for something and now I'm done with that search, I can click on the X to remove these. So I'm going to simplify this down to just Tulsa for now. And I wanted to point out underneath the county, we have a recording date. Now this recording date is going to indicate to us when it was that we last received data from the county. So the county assessor's office last provided us fresh data for Tulsa on the 12th. Now you may see that some of the counties are going to be a little bit behind. It always depends on how frequently they're updating or what exactly might be happening in that county. It seems like there's a lot of assessors' offices that have recently moved to a new software. So the delays on getting fresh data has actually been shortened, which has been really nice to see. Previously, we would find that there were some counties that may not have actually updated their information for, upwards of a couple of months. So it's nice to be able to have access to the freshest data, and especially after everything happened in 2020, seeing that fresh data come in again has been a refreshing sight. Since for a while there was a couple counties that we didn't see fresh data for, well, since 2019. But I'm going to leave mine set to just Tulsa County. When I hit apply, it returns me back to my screen so that I've got my search function over here on the left. My map is back, my list is back, and I can see up at the top left, I've got Tulsa County chosen. Now, if I hold my cursor over this, it'll also indicate to me my recording date. See how there's that little pop-up that shows there? So for instance, if I were running a search and I was like, wait a second, this doesn't seem like this is entirely up to date, or I know that that property that I'm looking at was actually supposed to have sold. I don't understand why it's not showing me that it is sold in the system now. All of that might be related to what that recording date was. Now, the good news is if I go back into Change County and I chose, let's do Carter County, Murray, Love, and of course, I always forget the southernmost county for our new association in Ardmore that's become a part of our MLS. But once I've selected multiple counties, if I hold my cursor over this, it'll still do the exact same thing. And this is also an easy way to find out if I do have the correct county chosen as well. So for instance, if I were trying to run a search and I thought that I had Osage connected, but I can't seem to find the property, double check what your counties are up at the top by holding your cursor over it. So instead of having to click on the change county to see the information, you can just hold your cursor over it. And then you only have to click on change county when you need to actually make an update. There we go. All right. Now, the county obviously is going to define a lot of the information that we're going to be working with. I did want to point out that one of the elements on this search function that is not going to be tied to what county we're in is going to be the address right up here at the top. Now that means that whenever you get into Realist, if you have an address already in mind, you can just dump the entire address into the top here. It actually doesn't matter what county you have selected. So whenever you do your search, it'll find that property anywhere in the state. Now, I do want to point out as well that this happens to be something that you're going to have to give a variable amount of information to. What that means is that if I type in a address, Riverside Drive, I have not put in a city, I have not put in a state or even a zip code, but this amount of information did provide me, right down here at the bottom, you can see my live results count, which shows me one match. So even though I haven't given everything that I need to yet, it may still be able to find a single match. Now, if I were to put in something a little bit more ambiguous, like if this were Main Street or something like that, there's a pretty good chance that I might actually need to go through and clarify which of the cities that it happens to be in. So for instance, if I did 14 matches. Yeah, so see, we're gonna have to actually clarify that a little further. And we just type this out the same way that we would be typing out an address if we were putting it onto an envelope. So if I type in Tulsa, I don't think there are any results for that. Oh my, that's not good. So if I hit search, then I can actually see my results. It's gonna try and clarify for me which one I mean. Which actually doesn't look like I do have any in Tulsa. So, and actually, speaking of which, this was going to be the next thing we were going to talk about anyway. If we do end up having a situation where you've done a search for maybe something that isn't exactly clear to the system, it's going to ask you to do a clarification, either like this, where it's actually trying to find a specific address. It recognizes you typed in something that should be leading to just one property. So it's going to ask you whether you'd like to clarify the results a little bit. Another alternative is going to be if you end up typing in a search. So let's try Smith. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to see that I have 2,387 matches for Tulsa County. So if I end up running my search, an alternative is going to be that it's going to have too many results to display. And what it's going to ask is whether or not I would like to actually show the first 1,000, or if I realized that I've made a mistake in searching for so many properties or so many names, whatever the case may be, I can refine my search further and make sure that I have the right spot. So for instance, if I wanted to make sure I was just looking in Broken Arrow, okay. This will narrow it down. It recognizes that this portion of the address that I've typed in is the city, and this is the state. So now it's only going to be providing me search results for people who are named Smith in Broken Arrow. Now, this is another option for what we're going to get whenever we run a search. So when I hit search, this time it's going to fill my map up with all of the properties that have Smith in the owner name. And then it's going to fill up my results down here to show me all of the different properties that I might be able to view. Now, the last option, whenever we run a search, is going to be 1373. We'll do that Riverside Drive that I was talking about. Riverside Drive. I provided it just enough information. It found a property at Tulsa, in Tulsa County, one match. This time when I hit search, instead of filling up my map, instead of filling up my list, it's actually going to pull me directly into the properties report. Because we did only find one property, it's just going to assume that that's actually the information that you were looking to find. So it's not always going to just provide you the dot and the list. if you do search for one property, it'll just jump right in there and you can start reviewing the property's details. All right, now I'm going to head back. So the last thing that we need to discuss when we're looking at the quick search function, so we've already pointed out the address. We used the owner name. I want to mention as well that the owner name option here actually has a is or starts with. The is option means that if I actually know exactly who I'm searching for, I can type in their last name. There we go. And if you notice, I have 0 matches. Now again, this little qualifier is actually very important. The reason why it defaults to starts with is because if you actually have the exact name that they're going to be putting onto the tax record, so notice right here, we've got the owner's name is Zenthofer. If I type in Zenthofer, that may be a portion of their name, but it's actually going to be looking at what the counties actually got in there. And if it has the combination like this actually shows where it's Zenthofer, Christopher, and then it looks like maybe even a, oh yeah, see if it's even got this separated out. The reason why I usually recommend people to leave it on starts with is because of situations just like this. So now that we change this over to starts with, I see that I've actually got 3 extra properties beyond the one that I found already. We also have a little plus icon over here to the right, which allows me to add in more names. There we go, Johnson, and so on. So you can actually search for multiple different names in case you happen to be looking for multiple different people. Excellent. All right. We have a section here for the MLS listing number. And then finally, we have the tax parcel ID search, which allows us to find properties based on just the details of their parcel number. Now, if you guys may have noticed, this actually does have a relatively limited scope of support. So for instance, we have to have either the address, the owner's name, and hopefully spelled correctly, especially when we have somebody like Zenthofer, the MLS number, which we would have to have done some research on in advance to either get that from Matrix or ask the listing agent for that number, or you have to have the parcel information in advance, which again, sometimes getting that out of the owner can sometimes be a little bit of a difficult thing. And especially when you have counties that you're working with that maybe separate things out with these hyphens. If you have a hyphenated number like this, it may not always be able to track it down. It's always going to depend on how the county has actually entered the data. So let's actually clear off my search. I'm going to click on the Clear Searches button down here at the very bottom. This makes sure that there's no dots on my map, and it clears out any of the stuff that I had down here in my results as well. Now let's move on to the My Search function. So again, just to highlight some of the limitations on this, you have to have some of the information already in hand in order to use the quick search. So if you guys do just need to jump into a specific tax record, this is a great way to do it. But for the rest of the time, when you guys don't have enough information, or maybe you're just trying to search for something very specific, this might not be able to give you as much information as you were hoping so, which is why we actually recommend you guys typically switch over to the My Search first and foremost. Now, if you guys have not used the My Search much before, I do recommend that you guys click on this Saved Search function up at the top here and choose the option for General Query. The General Query Saved Search is actually something that we constructed a while ago that has most of the elements that you guys would be using the most. So for instance, the most frequently used things were searching by an owner's name, and then searching by their address, which we've actually broken down into a couple of different elements, searching by subdivision, city, and for those of you guys who work with rural properties, you may end up needing to use the township, range, and sections. So if you do end up having a property that you're not entirely certain of where it's actually going to be located, but you do have the legal description, for instance, or maybe you've got a brand new property that's going to be set up in a new subdivision, you can search by township, range, and section to see if that parcel's there. But in my case, I'm actually going to focus first. We've already covered how to use the owner name. We've got the is and starts with. We've got a little plus icon. Let's talk now about the separation that we have here for the street. So for instance, if I have an address that I'm trying to search for, let's say that I'm looking for 5125 South Sandusky Avenue. So the property I've got in mind is 5125 South Sandusky Avenue. Put that up on the screen here. The way that they have this broken down, and the same way that we actually break this down in matrix as well, is broken down into a couple different elements of the actual address. So the house number is actually only going to be interested in this 5125. So I'm going to copy that, put that in there. So I've got 5125 for the house number. The street name is actually not concerned with any of the pre-directional, or if this was North Sandusky Avenue East or South Sandusky Avenue East, we would drop the south, we would drop the avenue and the east, and the only thing that it's actually interested in is just the name of the street. So that's all we have to put in there. If you guys remember from before when we were searching for the address when we were using the quick search, down here at the bottom it provided us this little live count of what the amount of results would be. I see that I've only got one match. So without actually having to provide any extra details like the south or the avenue east or anything like that, I've actually already found the property that I'm probably looking for. Now, the street suffix section, even though it does seem to be unnecessary for this search, I do want to point out that this only allows us to type in so many characters. So I'm going to just bring my keyboard close so you guys can hear me doing this. Notice it doesn't allow me to type more than 4 characters at a time. Now, what that means is that when you're typing this in, you're only going to have access to the abbreviations of the street names. So for instance, avenue, street, oops, court, and of course one of the long ones, boulevard. So just remember that's only going to allow those 4 characters. So if you guys start typing in avenue, oh, wait, can't type any longer. It's just avenue that it's looking for. All right. Now we're going to talk about some complications that can occur with the search function. But before we do that, we kind of touched on this a moment before when I searched for a specific property and it pulled up a property report. This is the bread and butter of Realist. And so I'm actually going to just dive right into one of those property reports. And we're going to take a look at that first before we do anything else with adding complications to the search function. So I've got my property's address typed in here. I found my one match that I was looking for. So when I hit search, again, instead of leaving me on that search results page, it's going to dive right into the property report. Now there is a setting to be able to change that. I'll show you guys where to do that later if you guys don't like the way that that works. But in the interim, let's talk about this property report. Now the first thing that it's going to show us is the property details. I've got the address clarified up here at the top to make sure that I know exactly what the 911 address should be. And then immediately below that, I've got the photo, if there was a photo for a listing in the last, I believe it's 5 years. It's either 3 or 5 years. And then over to the right, it's got some of the basic elements of information that most of the time sellers and buyers are going to be interested in. Now, the bedroom count for Tulsa does happen to be missing. For whatever reason, Tulsa's county assessor's office does not actually get the bedroom count. No idea why. I don't necessarily agree with that decision. But you guys notice that this actually clarifies for us the bed count is actually coming directly from the MLS. That means that somebody has entered a listing into our listing data and provided that bedroom count for us. We're going to see this little qualifier here indicating that this is coming from the MLS in a couple other spaces. I'll make sure to point those out as we get through. We've got the building square footage, the lot square footage. Since it was listed in our MLS, we also have a MLS sales price. Then we also have the total number of bathrooms, which again is information that's coming directly from the listing data, the year build, the type, and then the most recent sales date, which is being provided again by the MLS. Now below that, we have our owner information. This is going to be an easy way for us to determine whether or not this is actually an owner-occupied residence. In this case, it does appear so. It actually shows that that's the same address where they're getting billed at as where the property is located. There are a couple options when we get back to customizing our search that allow us to clarify whether or not it is an owner-occupied property or not. This is how they're extrapolating that particular piece of information. Now, I'm going to minimize this particular section by clicking on this little caret here, the little arrow pointing down. The next section down is our location information. Every once in a while, we'll get calls from people asking us for the subdivision that they're supposed to use on the particular property, or potentially even asking us about the township range and section. Both of those are going to be provided under the location information. If it does turn out that the township range and section is not clarified in there, I would recommend using some of the tools that you guys were made aware of whenever you became realtors. I know that this is something that gets covered during that licensing process, but unfortunately, the MLS does not provide any expectation of giving you guys that information. If you guys do end up needing to track that down, every single property, every single address, every single parcel in Oklahoma does have a township range and section. Even if the county seems to think otherwise, the township range and section actually covers our entire state. So not to worry. Even if it's not included in here, again, that just means the county assessor's office isn't tracking it. You might still be able to extrapolate what that's supposed to be by using some of those tools that you guys have access to. All right, I'm going to minimize this section. The next section down is going to be our tax information. This is where I usually recommend people go to get the parcel. The parcel number is going to appear the exact same way that it should appear on the county records. And this is a great way for you guys to make sure that you have the exact information to connect to your listings. So for instance, this property that I've pulled up here in Matrix, the agent did go through the process of actually getting the parcel number and added that onto their listings so that now they actually can have all of the tax record information connected directly to the listing data. So this does actually work as effectively a two-way street, meaning if the tax parcel number that's in Realist is the exact same number that we have in Matrix, Matrix will actually populate the tax information onto that listing for you. So this kind of is one of the sections of information that's going to allow us to have that intermingling of data from the tax record information into the MLS data. Now, next section down, we've got our assessment and tax. This shows us the assessment value. We've also got the tax year indicating to us what the amount of tax was. Now, this is not necessarily going to be the amount that the owner actually paid. This is just what the tax should have been. I like that they actually break this down as well into what the total tax was, as well as the change between each of the years. Now, this is a great way to keep track of any trends. So for instance, if you do end up having a buyer that's wanting to make sure that they're not going to end up having a dramatic increase in what the taxes are, this is at least a rough estimation of a trend if there is any major changes. Now, further down, we have a section simply called characteristics. Now, the characteristics is going to include all of the details that the county has provided to us. Now, this is where we're going to start getting into some of the options to customize this view. Now, a lot of the details that we're seeing on here are going to be coming directly from the tax record information. I see a couple options on here, or a couple elements on here are actually being filled out directly from the MLS. So for instance, Tulsa County, again, does not keep track of garage capacity, the bedrooms, and the total baths, which actually it does look like it keeps track of here. If you see anything that actually does have this little prefix saying MLS, that's indicating to you that that actually is something that got pulled over from the listing data. Now, if we see the total number of bathrooms here, I'm going to hold my cursor over it. Notice how above where my cursor is right now, there's the tax : 3 MLS : 3. That means that there's actually some continuity here. This is indicating to us that the tax records indicate that there's 3 and the MLS indicates that there's 3. If there were a discrepancy, so for instance, maybe the owners had actually expanded on the property, maybe the listing has actually got an appraisal done on it, so now we actually have an accurate square footage or an accurate number of bedrooms, bathrooms, etc. You may actually see the information displayed like this, where instead of it showing just MLS, it may actually show another section here that says tax, and those numbers may be different. Now, I would always recommend reaching out to the listing agent to verify how they got that information, if there was an appraisal done on it, or if there was maybe some details that you might need to clarify with them. Once you guys have spoken to them, hopefully that'll clear that up for you. But in the interim, if there are any discrepancies between the tax records and the listing data, it'll display that. Otherwise, it actually won't show you anything, and it'll just show you what the consolidated information agrees on. All right. Now, let's actually talk briefly about some of the viewing options. You may come across some listings and some properties here and there that you're actually wanting to see more information about this. Now, for instance, if I wanted to know, let me actually scroll back up here to the location information. If I have a property that happens to be in what I thought was a historical district, I can jump into the property's details. I'm looking at this report and I'm seeing, oh, it doesn't look like I've got any of that information in here. Or maybe I've pulled up a property that has not passed through our MLS, and subsequently it doesn't have a bedroom count. Maybe I'm not familiar with whether or not that particular county that I'm working in actually has a bedroom count. Like, for instance, you guys have all been made aware now of the fact that Tulsa doesn't keep track of the bedroom counts. But if your county happens not to as well, and you notice that there is no bedrooms listed here, that may be because that information has not been filled out and subsequently has just been eradicated from this complete listing. Up at the top right corner, there is a customized view option. And what this allows us to do is switch between a fixed view and a dynamic view. Now, the dynamic view, as you guys can see, is actually my default. This is what is going to show whenever you guys get into Realist for the first time, and will stay that way until you guys make a change. In my case, if I do want to switch this over so that I see all of the available fields, whether there's information filled out by the county or not, I can actually switch this over to fixed. And when I click on apply, what this is going to do is dramatically expand the amount of information that I have available to me. But unfortunately, it also doesn't really show me anything extra. So for instance, now I see that I've got my historical preservation zoning code and historical preservation district, but even though it's added those fields back in, there isn't anything on here. So if you guys prefer this particular view so that you always know where you're going to be able to find the exact same details. So for instance, if I wanted to always know how many half baths there were, whether there was any or not, that's perfectly fine. You guys can leave it on this view. I do want to point out though, that when you guys end up sending this to someone, whether you've printed it or emailed it, it will include all of the fields that you have on here, which means that you can dramatically increase how many or how many pages this is actually going to export to just by changing that. So if you guys don't like this, if you guys don't mind that it's just not showing you ground floor area, main area, second floor area, if those details aren't being filled out either by the county or by that on that particular property, seeing that is not going to help me. So I do usually recommend people to use the dynamic, but I want to make sure that you guys are aware of that in case you do end up needing to change that later. Now, some of the other options on here I'm going to discuss in a moment. Let's actually get back to our, oops, I forgot to save it. Let me switch to dynamic and hit apply. There we go. All right, so once we're done with our characteristics section, this is just extra information. You can see the square footage, the garage square footage, if the county happens to be providing that. Next, it's going to show me a cell score indicator. Now, the cell score indicator is one of the few parts of the system that is kind of just being automated completely. Now, the cell score indicator, as indicated underneath here, is telling us the relative likelihood a property is going to be listed for sale in the next 6 months. Now, this number is actually going to change. In fact, if you guys look at some of the previous recordings of our Realist webinar, this number actually will change pretty frequently. In fact, it actually will change almost on the fly. So for instance, I taught a Realist class on and actually indicated this particular property back in January, and the number was much higher. Actually, it was in the moderate section here under the hot, or no, not, excuse me. Right now it is in low, moderate, high. Yeah, it was in the high section. It was actually just over the cusp here. I think it was like 638 or something. So this has actually changed, and it's always going to be updating this based on the market. So for instance, if the market has some dramatic fluctuations or the area that this particular property is located in happens to have some movement in it, you may notice that this sell score indicator is going to fluctuate. Now, if you guys don't like having your computers be a, you know, real estate market Nostradamus, this might not be beneficial information. So we're going to talk about how to remove that in just a minute here. The other option that is often going to be removed is the next section down. It simply says estimated value. Now, for those of you guys who have had plenty of experience talking to sellers that saw their Zillow estimated value, the Zestimate as they like to refer to it, you may actually come across some people that don't want to be reminded of what the system thinks the property's value should be after you as the real estate expert has provided them a more accurate value. So this might not be something that you want to see, or it might not be something that you want to share. Uh, if you do end up finding that this isn't beneficial information, we're going to talk about how to remove that in a moment. Now, the estimated value, just to give you guys at least an overview before we show how to remove it, we've got a static number right here. This is the real AVM. And for those of you guys who haven't been through our CMAs class, the AVM is the automated valuation model. Now, the fact that this is actually a trademarked piece of information, so the real AVM, is indicating that this is actually something that CoreLogic, who developed Realist for us, CoreLogic has actually produced an AVM, again, automated valuation model, that they consider proprietary and includes information both from the MLS as well as the public records. So this number shouldn't be too far from what the actual value should be, but it does provide us a range as well. Now, this range is usually going to give us either a really broad range, like this particular one has, where it's just shy of $80,000 or 70,000. Excuse me, I'm bad at math today. And we've got a update to the value. So when it was that it actually was last appraised for market conditions and whether it needs to be increased or decreased. And then over here to the right, it provides us a confidence score. Now you guys can notice down here in the fine text, the confidence score is a measure of the extent to which sales data, property information, and comparable sales support the property valuation analysis process. The confidence score range is 50 to 100. Now this has actually been updated recently. It used to say 60 to 100, and it used to be that this particular property, actually the reason why we chose this originally, it was comfortably sitting there at 60, which meant that it was on the very, very bottom of what was allowed for us to actually depict a estimated value. If there is no estimate to the value because it actually falls below what the new score range is, the 50, this section will not be there. So you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to see it. But let's say that we actually want to get rid of this section permanently. So for instance, I just don't want to actually see this estimated value again in the future. No problem. I'm going to go back to that customized view. And remember, when we were in customized view before, the only thing I was talking about was fixed versus dynamic. This time, let's actually talk about our check boxes and our selected over here on the right. Now, remember this interface from earlier, we were talking about the county showing us this information, where we have checkboxes on the left, the selected on the right, and occasionally we may have categories. But in this case, I actually want to get rid of a couple things. This estimated value, definitely don't want that, so I can just uncheck it from here. Or over here on the right, if I just want to hit the X on it, that'll also get rid of it as well. So notice if I click the X here, it just undoes the checkbox here for propensity sell score. And I think that actually should be it. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hit apply, and it gets rid of both of those pieces of information. So underneath characteristics, there is no longer the sell score indicator nor the estimated value. So I'm happy with that. Now I actually get down to the next section, which is just simply listing information. Again, if a property has not been listed, similar to the way that the estimated value or maybe even the propensity sell score is, if there is no data on how likely it is to sell, what the estimated value is, or if it's never been listed, these sections will not appear. But since this particular property has very clearly been listed before, I do see the listing number and a lot of the details all this section up here at the top is all going to be details about the most recent listing. Underneath that, we see the previous listings. If there had been more than just these three, it would continue moving backwards. So for instance, we might see something from 2001 and then 1999 and then 1993 if you got something from Tulsa County. So this listing information down here is just going to be more of a record from before the most recent listing, which again is indicated up here at the top. Now, you do see that this little listing number option is actually a link. If I click on this, it's actually going to show me the complete history for this particular property. So it's not just showing me the most recent listing, it's actually showing me all of the listings in Matrix for that particular property. Now, if you happen to be from an association or an area that recently joined the MLS, and by recently, I mean, I could mean Bartlesville, for instance, which I think was like 7 years ago that they joined. A lot of historical data may have been provided to us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you guys will have an illustrious history for each listing. So if you do end up in a situation where you're not seeing any listing data, but you know that it was listed in maybe the previous MLS that you guys were using, sometimes this might be empty. So, but next let's move on to a section that will always be present. It is the last market sale and sales history. Now, similar to the way that the listing data was depicted, the information up at the top of this section is going to represent the most recent sale. And we see that there's a discrepancy here between when the tax record reflected that it was closed and when the MLS reflected that it was closed. So I mentioned before that if there are any discrepancies, we'll see those little prefixes indicating it to us. And then below that, we actually see the more comprehensive view of the history, which again is going to be any time the property changed hands. Now that doesn't even mean that it had to change hands because of a sale. Notice we've got a sale price section. And then below that, we actually have a nominal change. What this means is that it could have changed from potentially an individual to a trust, or in this case, maybe Tara Brother, who ended up buying the property from the Eileen Cannon Living Trust. Tara ended up getting married to Robert Cope, and so subsequently she ended up putting it under both of their names, which is this nominal change that's been indicated here. Now, I mentioned before that if we had any previous listings, they would go back. The same thing works with our sales history. I can actually scroll left and right to see the older sales, and there's also an arrow that allows us to move back and forth in case you don't want to use the scroll bar. Now, let's actually take a little tour back for this particular property. As I scroll over to the right, or use my arrow to scroll over to the right, I see the oldest of the records. This happens to be when the property was initially made, and of course the Armstrongs bought it in 1993. We see the initial price. They ended up selling it to the Espo Construction Company for a significantly smaller sum. Maybe there was some kind of catastrophic damage to the property, ended up having to be rebuilt. Espo Construction finalized that and then sold it to the Cannons. They sold it for $160,000. The Cannons ended up moving this into a trust. Again, notice this Y indicating it is a nominal change. And then the trust ended up selling the property to Tara Brother. Tara got married, her legal name changed. Her and Robert ended up putting it under both of their names. And then they subsequently sold it in 2013 to Michael Taylor. So it's easy enough to navigate that. I'm going to scroll down now. We've got our mortgage history. If there isn't any mortgage history on there, again, this section won't appear, but we see the information regarding when it was that a mortgage was done, including something that just happened at the very end of last year. This is always interesting information, but not quite so fun when we have to pull it up for somebody. So then finally, at the very bottom of the page, we have the property map. Now it gives us two different views. We have the parcel dimensions. These numbers that we're seeing indicated here are actually just estimates. I would recommend taking these with a grain of salt. Also, there is a curve to the front of the property. It broke that down into separate sections of the curve. So again, estimates like this might need to be modified a little bit. So you shouldn't assume that this is actually going to be the total number, which was 60, just shy of 80. And then over here to the right, this is the contextual map. So this one's more focused on showing us the information about the parcel. This one is kind of giving us the context of this parcel, showing us what roads are nearby, giving us a little bit more information about that. Now, if I needed to actually get back to the map, so for instance, if I have no idea where this is, obviously the main thoroughfare that this particular property is close to is not actually labeled on here. If I need to get back to viewing that, the back button up here at the top left of the screen will actually bring me back to my search. Remember the 3 details that I entered in here. And then I've got my map and I've got my list indicating 1 dot on the map and 1 result in the list. And I can zoom out from here and see, oh, it's 51st is right there. So now to get back into this, I'm just going to click on the reports button down here at the bottom right, or you can double click on the entry in the list, and we'll talk about the map functions later. So I'm going to jump back into my report. Now the next tab's over, and I'm going to have to double check my notes to make sure that I didn't skip something, or maybe I've moved a little too quickly through this, because this is actually supposed to have carried us to the top of the hour. I want to save the comparables so that we're not getting interrupted. Actually, you know what? This probably won't take 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and cover it now. So the next tab over, everything that we've been discussing so far has been under the property details. To the right of that is the comparables tab. Now, the comparables tab is actually going to be an automated function. So similar to the way that the AVM just automatically found what the price was supposed to be for this property, or what it anticipates the price is supposed to be, the comparables is actually going to run a automated function to find what properties are nearby. Now, we still have that customize view button up at the top right. This does have a different interface this time around. So notice we still have fixed or dynamic up at the top, but our list is no longer showing us all of the different options that we saw from the property details screen. It's only going to show us these 3 options. So we're not going to have to change that. What we might need to change, though, is how Realist is actually searching for those comparables. I'm going to click on this search criteria option. What this is going to allow me to do is customize how it's finding comparables if I do actually want to use the comparable search within Realist. So the first thing it wants us to ask is how many comparables we actually want. We can get up to 50. Now that might be a little bit too much, but maybe you actually want to leave yours somewhere around 20 because that might actually work for your area. But you can increase or decrease that depending on the property that you're working with and how many comparables are nearby. Now the sort method, as well as all of the related checkboxes underneath it, I would recommend leaving those on the default, so I'm not going to cover those. I do want to point out that the data source option should always be left to both. If you have it just to tax, you won't get to see any extra information about the properties that are currently on the market. If you set it just to MLS, you may end up missing out on some of the FSBOs. So I recommend you leave that on both. Leave the pool on no preference. The distance from subject, this is actually one that we may want to change. Now, if you guys have participated in our CMAs and matrix class, we kind of discuss how to find comparables in that. I usually recommend that you guys don't go over a mile, but this is also going to be something that you may need to adjust depending on how far away your property is from other properties in its vicinity. So for instance, for those of you guys working out in rural areas, you may have a property that doesn't have anything that's comparable within miles and miles of it. So the maximum that it allows you to get it to is 10, again, as you guys can see indicated over here. But if you guys can, try to limit yourself to a mile or half a mile. In fact, some lenders actually won't accept a comparable entry if it's over a certain distance, especially for those of you guys who may have some experience with creating BPOs. You guys are probably painfully aware of some of the restrictions that lenders have on what's truly considered comparable. Now, I'm going to leave mine set to, let's do a mile. The sales price is a great way to artificially change your results. I don't recommend using that. Year built is going to be situational. Maybe don't put in anything in the year built unless you have a property that's relatively unique for the neighborhood that it's in. Same thing goes with bedrooms, bathrooms, stories. All of these are going to be things that I wouldn't recommend that you guys actually make a change to. The system is going to automatically try and restrict those to an extent so that you're not finding properties that are dramatically different just because it happens to have the same square footage or lot frontage or whatever. Now, further down, we have another section that's called search time period. This is the only other one that I recommend people make changes to. So let me review that real quick just to reiterate. The number of comparables, I recommend people to adjust depending on where you're actually working. You don't want to have too many. You also don't want to have too few. I also recommend the distance from subject be something that you change. And then finally, the search time period is something I recommend that you guys mess with, but I only recommend going to 6 months. It allows you to go to 12 months. And again, this is going to be more just for those of you guys working with properties that are kind of far away. Uh, the reason why we don't recommend going over 6 months back is because the market might have changed pretty dramatically. I mean, you couldn't ask for a more perfect example than it being 2021, and we've got 12 months back in 2020. The market was very different. Now, of course, February of 2020 wasn't quite there to, the dramatic differences, but even the months following that, you saw a dramatic decrease in inventory and a dramatic uptick in values. So I probably don't want to go back further than 6 months, even under normal circumstances, but especially right now. But again, if you guys are working with rural properties or in a market that doesn't have too much fluctuation within it, 12 months is fine. Kevin's got a question. If we come across the issue of lack of comparable property, would we ask the lender what they recommend? I think that's actually a great place to start. Again, I would recommend if you guys do end up finding that you're having a dry spell with finding comparable properties for that property that you're working with, adjust the time period and adjust the distance, but keep those within reason. And then I would actually take the data that you've gotten. So for instance, if I increase this to 10 miles and I increase the time frame to 12 months to maximize my results, I may still want to introduce to the seller, here's what I found, but here's the caveat with this. These might not really be comparable. They might be in different markets. They might have sold so long ago that the price is no longer relevant. I showed this to the lender. The lender told me that maybe this does happen to be good or bad data, but they would actually be a good authority on whether or not something is truly comparable. So yeah, that's a good question, and you're already on the right track. I would ask the lender about that. Awesome. Now, the living building area, notice it automatically has a percentage difference built into it. And the same thing goes for the lot area. It's got a 15% difference built into it. If I end up restricting these, I usually am only going to do so based on if the property is kind of unique to its area, or if I'm actually finding way more properties than I was needing for my comparable. These are a great place to start doing restrictions. You can also, again, make some restrictions to the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, year built, etc., based on whether or not you're finding properties that are too dissimilar to the property that you're working with. So for instance, if you find a property that's, $500,000 when the property you're working with is only 200,000, and you see that the bedroom count is way off and the square footage is actually like literally on the cusp, it's like 14.9% difference. Well, maybe that's not a property that we want to include, and I can restrict that with the bedroom count, or I can restrict that with my living area percentage count. Just set that to 10% instead or something. Now, the last couple sections on here, again, just like a lot of the other defaults that you guys saw me skip over, these aren't relevant. The style, I wouldn't recommend that you guys actually add in. The style will just kind of be one of those things that if they know what the style is, maybe they can mark it properly, but oftentimes if the county isn't tracking it, or if the agent doesn't understand what the property is that they're looking at, this might actually end up causing a little bit of a spanner in the works. And then finally, the same thing goes for our land use. The same as subject option is the best choice here. This is actually going to be dynamic, which means that if I'm looking at a property that's a single family residence and I go to the comparables tab, the only comparables it's going to find for me are going to be single family residences. Same thing goes if I end up looking at a condo, it's only going to find condos as comparable properties. So that way I'm not going to end up accidentally shooting myself in the foot by setting this once and then not realizing I've done that. And then I come back later and find that I have no properties as comparable because the property I was looking at was a condo and the property that I found as a comparable is a single family residence. So just leave that as a default. Now, all of the changes that I've been making so far, again, have been to serve the purpose of this particular comparable that I'm trying to fashion, or CMA that I'm trying to fashion. Now, down here at the very bottom of the screen, after I've made all of these changes, there are 3 buttons. We've got cancel, which just leaves things as they are, doesn't take any of the changes I've made to this. I've got save and submit, which means that it's actually going to save all of the settings that I've put in here as the default. Now, this could be incredibly beneficial for those of you guys who are working with rural properties. Maybe you guys are almost always working with properties that are out in the boonies, so you've got this set to maybe within 5 miles and 12 months back. Cool. Whatever you've set it towards that time that you went in and found a property that you were pretty much always going to be working with properties like it, you can do save and submit. It keeps those settings, and that way when you come back, it'll remember all of that so that you don't have to keep on coming in, changing these all around, just to make sure that you're finding the right information. Now, if you do end up having a property that's not like everything else that you've worked with, then in that case, you just use the submit button. So again, save and submit is going to save any settings that you've put in here as your default. So that's what it's going to use the next time you click on the comparables tab and the next time you need to find comparables for your property you're working with. If I just hit submit, it's going to take whatever these changes are and only run it for this particular property that I'm working with. So just remember what the save and submit buttons are going to do. I'm going to hit save and submit. And what this is actually going to produce for me now is going to be a little bit broader search. I expanded my search out to a mile. Hey, look at that. Now I've actually got 16 properties instead of just 3. And I can see my subject property up here at the top of the list. It'll always stay there at the top, so I can scroll down and actually compare the property to each of the other properties on this list and find out whether or not certain properties are actually comparable or not. Once I'm happy with my results, I can actually just hit that generate report option. But if I do find something that's maybe not comparable, so for instance, I've got 2,400. Oh, this one's on the low end. Maybe the price per square foot is significantly higher. Maybe this is actually a little bit too far away. So I'm going to just uncheck that checkbox. There we go. So uncheck the checkboxes for any of the ones that you actually don't need anymore. And then you can hit generate report, which finalizes all of the stuff into a complete report. Up here at the top, it's going to show me the map indicating where all of the comparable properties are. And then down below, I've got my search criteria, again, indicating how many properties it found, minus the ones that I've manually chose not to include, how it was sorting it, whether there was pools, the distance, the time frame that it was working with, the living or building area, the lot area, and then down here, it's got the statistics. So similar to how the CMA functions work in Matrix, where we've got the subject property, the high, low, median, and average. And then finally, at the very bottom, we get to do a side-by-side comparison between the property that we're working with, indicated by all of its little elements, and then comparing that directly to each of the properties. And if I want to move in between these, because remember we had 14 of these, I just click that arrow to move between them. And then when I'm ready to actually send this off, we'll use the print or email function. All right, so before we move on from the tab that we are currently on, I did want to circle back around to something that we may not have actually been too transparent with so far. Down at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, there are 2 buttons. We've got the print button and email button. Now, I pointed out this particular little collection when we were talking about the property details, but we didn't actually talk about what function they serve. So down there at the bottom left-hand corner, we've got a print button, which gives me 2 choices. I've got either quick print or customize print. And similarly, email is going to have quick email or customize email. So when I was looking at my comparables tab, I had a couple options that I needed to make sure of. I had a search criteria that I needed to modify. And then finally, I clicked on that generate report. I can now take this data, so the information that we got from our comparables, and either print that or email that. And again, on this page, it still gives me the same options, quick print and customize print, or quick email and customize email. So let's actually take this quick print first. So when I click on quick print, when I'm on the comparables tab, what this is going to do is actually take the information from the tab that I happen to be looking at and turn that into a printable PDF. So I click on the print button, and depending on what browser you're in, it may either choose to download the PDF, which is what mine's doing, or if you guys are in Chrome, Chrome's default is to just open up the tab and have that PDF automatically displayed. So I'm going to do this open with Firefox option so I can emulate that a little bit. And up at the top right corner, I've got a little print button. And similarly, if I were to pull up a PDF on Chrome, Chrome's going to have that same option up at the top right corner. There's a little save icon and then a little print button. Now, the PDF that I'm looking at right now is actually, again, just the comparables tab. So I don't have any extraneous information. The only thing that I've got when I did quick print is just that tab. So as I scroll down here, I can see that I've got my map, my search criteria, my summary statistics, and then the next couple pages are just going to be the subject property compared with a side-by-side comparison of the 14 properties that we got as well. So an additional 7 pages of information all the way down here to the bottom. Oh, not 7 pages. Man, I'm not doing the math very well today. But we've got the extra pages of information. And again, allowing us to do this side-by-side comparison can be really helpful for the client. Oh, and hey, look at that. We've got a discrepancy here between what the tax record indicates versus what the MLS indicates. So again, that's what that's going to display as. And actually, let me make this a little bit larger so that's more visible. There we go. So if you guys ever see this, again, that's indicating that the MLS has one number, the tax records have another. So it looks like the missing bathroom in this particular property's case is that the MLS has an additional half bathroom. Maybe the owners actually added in another part of the house or whatever. Now let's hop back into the report. Now the same function is actually going to work when we go to our property details, or in fact, actually any of these other tabs. We have the print, which has quick print and customize print. Let's now look at the customize print option, because we know that if I click on quick print for property details, all it's going to do is just pull up another PDF, but this time instead of showing me all of the comparable properties, it's only going to show me the details about the property itself. But if I go down to customize print, this is going to give me the option to include other tabs from the same report. So if I'm happy with seeing the property details and I want to also show my seller the comparable properties in the area, I can include both of those by just checking the checkbox for both of them. And then when I click to proceed, it'll take those details, add them into a finalized report, and include all of that in one PDF. So that way you don't have to go through the rigmarole of sending them 2 files. Everything will be consolidated, and you can just send them one comprehensive report that shows all of the property details, then the comparables, and I happen to include the neighborhood information as well, which we'll actually be covering in a moment here, which includes that at the very end of the report. So that's the difference that we've got between the quick option and customize option. Now the difference between the print function and the email function is that the email function is actually going to take our PDF that we're producing and just send it on its way to a specific email address. We don't end up having to see the PDF. We don't have to save it. We don't have to download it. We don't have to print it. It'll all just get sent out in an email, including the information that we want. So when I click on quick email, it's going to give me a reply to field. Because I'm on a training account, it doesn't actually have an email address connected to it. But under normal circumstances, you should actually see your email address pop up here at the top, so that even though it's actually going to be sent by CoreLogic from an email address that's just one big system output, whenever the client sees that email and tries to reply to it, they'll be replying to whatever email you provide up at the top here. There we go. And then the to field, of course, is one of the only other fields that's required, indicated by these asterisks. And all you have to do is just type in the email address you want to send it to. And that's it. Now you do have the option to add in a carbon copy, a blind carbon copy, include a customization of the subject, and you can also add in some extra details to the body of the email as well. Now, I do not have a signature that I've customized for this particular training account, but if you do end up having a customized signature on here, that'll automatically appear. And we'll be talking about those settings when we get to the end of class. Just as an aside, if you guys haven't heard this joke, the patron saint of emails is actually Saint Francis of Assisi. Yeah, that's a good dad joke. Anyway, so if I hit the send on this, again, the only thing that I'm going to be sending off to them at the moment would just be this particular tab if I chose quick email. If we do decide that we want to send more portions of this report at the same time, like if I wanted to send the details, the comparables, and also include the neighborhood profile, again, I'll just need to choose customize email, check the checkboxes for each of the ones that I want, and then hit proceed. Brings me to the exact same page that we saw before where it finalizes the PDF. But again, instead of actually getting all of this information, producing a PDF that I have to view, it just brings me into the email and I send that on its way. All right, now let's talk next about our Market Trends tab. Now the Market Trends tab does still have a print function. It only allows you to print off this particular tab. You may have noticed when we were looking at the comparables, or not the comparables, the customize email and customize print, there was 5 tabs up at the top, but there was only 4 options for checkboxes. They don't typically want this information to be sent out just because of the fact that this is more for your edification than it is typically for a client's. What this market overview is going to be showing us is a lot of the details about what's happening in the area with not a lot of explanation anymore. It used to be that Realist had some little USA Today style explanations of what each of these was meant to indicate to you, but now it's just left to the imagination of the individual that's reading this or to you as a market expert what this is all supposed to be showing you. Now, the only thing that I think is actually really beneficial for you guys is going to be these top 2 reports. We've got the median sales price for tax and median sales price for MLS. This is something that I also would recommend taking a critical eye to, as you guys have probably become painfully aware of. Misinformation is very easy to disguise, and it's easy to hide something in statistics or numbers. So you might want to double check to see what the legend is over here on the left-hand side and down here at the bottom of the sheet. So this median sales price for tax is actually indicating to us what the sales price was for the zip code, the city, as well as the county. Now the zip code is going to be this purple line, and I can see that it looks like on November 2020, the median sales price for the zip code was actually $210,000. Now I'm going to scroll down here. I see that the median sales price for the MLS, which means that these are all the properties that sold through the MLS. This is a separate value because these are going to include potentially some FSBOs or nominal changes, etc. Whereas the MLS is going to be only properties that were listed. Now, if you do live in an area where realtors are actually kind of the best way for people to sell their property, you may notice that the median sales price is actually going to be higher than what it might be for the tax side. Now, this is also going to have a discrepancy between what the legend is up at the top. Each of these is compartmentalized. So that means that we're going to be looking at all of the data contained within here is trying to be set up in a way that's going to be beneficial. So it's going to have a top and a bottom that's going to make sense for the information it's depicting. When I scroll down here to the MLS side of things, you notice that the left-hand side is actually a different set of numbers, and the bottom is actually going to be a different set of months. The tax side ended on November of 2020. Ours ended on January of 2021. So if I wanted to find a apples for apples comparison where I see November of 2020, I need to actually move back a couple steps on my median sales price and see, it looks like it was only $2,000 higher on the MLS side of things. But it does look like it's trending upwards, and you can even see on a couple spots here, like let's say we've got September of 2020, the median sales price for tax records, which again includes all those FSBOs, was 175,000. Meanwhile, on the MLS, it was 200,000. So there's a $25,000 discrepancy between the properties, median properties, sales price between those that were listed and those that were sold. And again, the median sales price by tax still includes those MLS numbers. So that means that there has to be a pretty dramatic shift in what the pricing is for properties that are being listed versus properties that are necessarily sold off market. All right. Now, next tab over is going to be neighbors. I'm not going to spend hardly any time on this because this is useful, I guess. I think it's an easy way for you to find out information you may not like about your buyer or seller. What this is going to show you guys is a bunch of dots on the map. There's a search criteria option that works similar to how comparables did, but notice there's a very different amount of information you can modify. Number of neighbors you can increase or decrease. You can have a maximum of 30 properties in the vicinity that are going to be referenced. And we also have the option to restrict our search distance so that we don't end up accidentally including things that aren't actually really the neighbors. But below that, we see a little report that shows us our subject property and all of the properties that are in the vicinity. The main reason why I don't like this particular report is because of this line right here. You may end up finding out that your client is maybe not disposed to living where there's rental properties, or maybe they're not particularly fond of certain elements of the other owner information that they don't like. So it might not necessarily be something that you want to give to people. Maybe you want to avoid that awkward conversation. So you can include this or not. I usually recommend not including it because, again, if they need it, they can ask for it. Otherwise, you're just kind of setting yourself up for weirdness. So let's move on now just to the neighborhood profile. Neighborhood profile is actually going to include a lot of demographic information, weather information, effectively just the quality of life in the area kind of stuff. So the neighborhood profile is going to start off with some of the demographics. What this is actually breaking everything down by is the zip code. It used to have a little indicator up here at the top that said what this was supposed to be based on, but it doesn't anymore. In the interim, though, just so you guys are aware, it's going to be breaking all of the data down by what zip code this is. So I see the estimated population, how much it's grown, increased or decreased, the number of households, the average household size, as well as how many of the households have children. We have a breakdown of the age ranges, and we have gender, male or female, what the marital status is. So some of this stuff maybe isn't going to be necessarily beneficial to your client that you're working with. But let's say, for instance, I've got a buyer, and it's a guy in his 40s. He's maybe single or divorced, and he's kind of wanting to get back out there. Okay, well, we see that we've got some demographic information for the zip code, so the people that are going to be in your immediate vicinity. Looks like there's actually a decent amount of people within his age range, some lower and higher, so that's nice. Got some options. It looks like there's more women than men. We see also how many people are married versus single, divorced, widowed, or separated. So he's still got plenty of wiggle room there as well. Housing information is going to be put on here. This is just going to be basic overview. We've got a median home sales price. This might actually be more beneficial for any investors that you guys are working with. Same thing goes down here at the bottom. We've got the occupancy defined by whether they own the property, whether it's being rented, or whether it's vacant. The market rents, notice it actually clarifies for us this isn't done by zip code. It's going to be done by county. And then finally, we have the quality of life information. This shows us how many workers in particular industries, blue collar versus white collar. And then down here at the bottom, we've got household income, showing us the general range of people. In fact, there's an unusual amount of people that are in that top bracket, oddly enough. And then finally, down here at the bottom, we've got our commute method. This is a property in America, so there's not really a lot of great public transit, but we do see a lot of people drive, a lot of people work from home, and a lot of people just drive themselves or walk themselves around on a bike, etc. Then finally, we've got our little weather thing indicating how cold it's going to end up getting, average, how hot it's going to get, again, average, and then of course the precipitation as well. All right. Now, there's a couple fields that I've actually chosen not to include on here. Up at the top right corner, we've got our search criteria. This is indicating to us if there are any of the businesses that we want to include, how far away we want them to be, and how many of the schools we want to include on this report, as well as the distance from them. But you may have noticed that I didn't have either of those on my report. Now, because I'm working with somebody that doesn't have kids, school doesn't matter for him at the moment. Because I'm working with somebody that, may have a tiny computer that has a GPS in his pocket, giving him what businesses are in the area might be an unnecessary amount of information. But I do have the option to customize my view, and you can see that I've got education, local businesses, and schools that I can add on here. So let's actually add those in and see what they provide us. So I'm going to scroll back down to the bottom. I've got education. This is going to show me how many, the kind of a general score indicator of the education level of this particular area. It's showing us how many people have less than a high school graduation, how many people are in college, gotten their associate's degree, bachelor's degree, graduate degree. And of course, there's some information down here at the bottom that indicates what this is actually meant to indicate, what the likelihood is, etc. Or not the likelihood, excuse me, where the score is being pulled from. Now, down below that, I've got my schools. Now, remember when we were looking at our search criteria option, it allowed us to modify how far away the schools are that we're going to be pulling into this. This is just showing me public schools that are in the vicinity, not necessarily what school the children that live in this property would be going to. Same thing goes with this private school. Obviously, this isn't a public school that the child's going to be going to by default, but maybe that's where you guys wanted to move towards. So seeing that it's within a mile might be beneficial. And then finally, this local businesses section. The reason why it was not included on here when I first got in here is because I don't think that this has actually necessarily been updated recently. And I don't mean, in light of all of the changes to which businesses exist after 2020 has kind of demolished a lot of industries. I'm talking about this might have not have actually been accurate even before that. So if you guys do choose to include this, I would recommend that they take some of the information in with a grain of salt. You do get to choose as well which businesses are going to be included. So again, if we do have our single buyer that wants to know if there's any businesses nearby that he might be able to frequent, we've got Red Lobster here, a great place to have a first date. As things get more casual, we can go to Sonic or Qdoba instead. There's plenty of shopping in the vicinity as well. So if you wanted to know that there's a grocery store nearby, you can include other kinds of businesses as well. So like, for instance, there's a jewelry place nearby. So if you needed to buy an engagement ring for whoever it was he found nearby. And there's also a Israel Diamond Supply. No, Israel Diamond Supply is the place that sells the jewelry. There's a jewelry buying company nearby as well. So if that all falls through, no worries. He can sell the ring back and go get himself some Qdoba to ease his pain. But again, choose to include those on a situational basis. I usually recommend leaving the education, local businesses, and schools out of the situation just because, again, if you need to provide that information to the client, I don't want stuff that's just in proximity to this property. I want to know which schools are going to be where a child would go. I don't need to know what local businesses are there unless the client is specifically asking for that. And again, we can add that caveat when we provide the information saying these businesses might not still be in existence, or maybe double check that they're actually still open, etc. So I'm going to hit apply. I'm happy with this. Again, if I do end up wanting to send this to my client, I still have that print and email button that allows me to either take this particular page or to include this page as well as some others by doing quick email or print or customize email or print. All right. Now, the last thing to discuss while we're looking at our property details or any of the report itself, there is a button down at the bottom right corner that allows us to take the data from this particular tax record and start a transaction with it. Now, for those of you guys who have participated already in our transaction desk class, you may remember that there is an import function from Realist, and there's also an option to import data directly from the MLS. All of that is great. This actually is a great way to ensure that you've got everything in there that you need, and it's being pulled from a valid source. So you're not having to guess at what the details are or ask the client for those details. You can just pull it straight from the tax records and import that directly into a transaction. All right, now let's head back to our map and let's actually talk about our next section. So we've gone through and talked about all of the report information. Let's now talk about how we can use the search a little better. So the search functions that we have kind of just skipped over since we went directly into a report are all going to be found under the drop down here, where we actually have a couple of pre-built searches for you, the general query, the foreclosure query, and you may even see a My Search default. But I also have a bunch of other search functions that I've saved for myself in the past. Now, there is an option to create a new search right up here at the top. I do want to show that this actually has one major glaring thing for me. I don't like starting with nothing. This is not beneficial to me because there was things that were built into that search that I actually used frequently. So now I have to go through this massive list of all of the different things that we can search by and find all of those things that I was able to search for before with that general query. So my recommendation would be, instead of using the create new search option, I'm actually going to go down here to the bottom, clear my search out. I've got owner name, house number, street name, suffix. I like all of those. I'm going to probably include those. Subdivision seems to be beneficial, city, zip code, but township range and section, I'm probably not going to be using those. So instead of actually starting a brand new search, I'm going to click on Customize Search. It shows that this is actually locked at the moment. Notice we've got that little gold padlock, and I can't change the name. Even over here on the right, remember how when we were looking at the other sections where we had a category and checkboxes, and then over here to the right, the selected attributes, those used to be blue, and I would have those X's to get rid of things if I didn't want them anymore. But at the moment, because this is just a general query that's actually been locked for the entire system, I can't make any modifications to it that way. But watch what happens when I end up adding something that I do want. So I'm going to scroll down here, and let's add in lot acres. So when I click on lot acres, it cleared out that little golden padlock. It actually has now a type search name. And over here to the right, my selected attributes are now open to modification. So I'm going to get rid of my township range and section. And this lot acres, I'm just going to leave that down at the bottom. Let's actually add in something I mentioned earlier. Remember when we were looking at the property details, I actually saw that the owner's tax billing address was the same as the property's address. This indicated to me that it was a owner-occupied residence. And in fact, if I actually want to find out whether properties are owner-occupied or not, maybe that's how I'm conducting a search, I can check the checkbox for owner-occupied. And again, it adds that to my list over here to the right. And I can click to drag that into a different position on the search, so that now I have owner occupied at the top, owner name, house number, street name, suffix, subdivision, blah, 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 and then lot acres, which I added a moment before. Now, the categories are going to become especially important when we're working with a list that's this large. So for instance, that owner occupied, instead of having to scroll down my massive list and try and read through all of these until I find what I'm looking for, I can also just click on a specific category, check the checkbox that I'm interested in, So like, let's go to geography, and let's say I wanted to add in the pre-direction and post-direction. There we go. So I can add in pre-direction. I'll put that before my street name, and we'll do post-direction after the street suffix. Perfect. So I've got this all set up. I think I'm happy with actually how this looks, and I actually want to save this as a permanent addition. If I just wanted to run a search with these elements and just keep this for now, and then when I get back into Realist later, it'll be back to my default, I can just click on Apply down at the bottom right here. And similar to how we were looking at the functions when we were talking about comparables earlier, where it had save and submit versus submit, the difference between save and apply is that apply is just going to let me run a search with these particular criteria on there now. Whereas save is going to take this and actually save all of these, and I have to give it a name, and it'll remember that for future reference. So again, when we were looking at saved searches, I saw all of those different search functions that I had from before. These are all things that I'd saved. So all I need to do now is just give it a name, owner occupied with address. Perfect. So I hit save. Now when I get back to my screen after I hit apply, now I have all of these extra elements. Right up here at the top, I've got my owner occupied, owner name, house number, pre-direction, which I added, post direction, which I added. I got rid of the township range and section. And then down here at the bottom, I've got my lot acres now showing. So let's talk about how that actually works out if we do end up making any adjustments to this. Like, let's say that you guys are only ever working with land and you're only ever working with really big pieces of land. Down here at the very bottom, I have my lot acres. Let's say that I'm only ever working with properties that are over 50 acres. Well, instead of being stuck with this is between, where I've got a range effectively, where I have to put in my minimum on one side, my maximum on the other, I'm going to switch this over to is greater than, or is less than. Now, if I do is greater than, I can do is over 50 acres. And if I really wanted to, what I can do is actually save this element as well as all of the other criteria that I've added as an independent search. So I can go to save. And this time what it's going to do is, instead of saving it as a search template, remember where we had all of the different criteria we could add to our search, this is going to save not only the search template, so each of the elements that I changed, as well as the values that I've entered into there. So when I add this on here, I'm going to see that it's going to have the lot acres saved, and it's actually going to have that for future use. There we go, save. So now when I go to my saved searches, I've got 50 plus acres. If I switch over to the one that I just was working on, click on owner occupied, notice it set it back to the default without any extra details on here. So it doesn't have the 50 plus acres, it's only going to be showing me the empty spaces. So just to clarify again, if you do end up having a search that you've constructed, or even a general query that you've added in some elements to, like if I just wanted to do Smith, I can save that search. Oh, and actually, let's cancel out of that. But I can save that search with that save button, or customize the search so I can add in different elements. All right. If you do end up deciding that you want to get rid of any of these, you can click on the name and then go to Customize Search. Oops. Oh, it did this to me last time. I apologize. Can you guys still hear? Actually, you know what? Raise your hand if you can still hear me. The last time it did that, I actually had a hiccup in my network connection. Okay, just making sure. Let me jump back into my search. And I think I had this under Mike's Mix. Yeah. Okay, so if I wanted to get rid of one of these searches, I can go to Customize Search. Notice it brought me into the Mike's Mix. If I want to get rid of this, there is a delete search over here to the right. And the same thing goes with, let's say I wanted to do this 50 plus acres. Maybe I saved this just because I was going to come back to it later. I can just hit delete search again. and that gets rid of it for me. You can also modify some of these. So for instance, let's say this default one that I chose. Let me get rid of this one first. There we go. This default one that I have, maybe I didn't actually want to save this with any of the values that I entered into the search. Maybe when I saved it, I accidentally saved it as a template with the values, and I meant to only save it as a template. I can just switch that over in here and then hit save. That'll actually clear out any of the values that were currently in there. And now I've got a separate search that's been constructed with the same criteria as that default, but now it actually has a new default that's going to be, down here at the very bottom. Perfect. And again, if I need to get rid of that, hit delete search, and I'm good to go. All right. Now, the other thing to mention, and I apologize. There we go. All right. Yeah, we're back to normal. The other thing to mention is just that whenever you guys have done any of the search functions over here on the left, this is mostly focused on just specific criteria that we're going to be working with. If you guys do have something that's a little bit more general, that's when we can start using some of these map tools. So for instance, let's say that I had a specific area that I wanted to search in, but the area that I'm wanting to search in isn't particularly well defined by maybe a zip code or a subdivision or even a city or whatever the case may be. I actually want to draw on my map so that I have a specific area. This is especially beneficial in Matrix whenever you guys need to do a search for a client that has maybe an area that they're wanting to live in or something like that. But let's actually show what it looks like from the Realist side of things. So I actually want to do a search for this little area right here. Maybe I'm trying to do some prospecting in this area and find some potential buyers or sellers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get that loaded into where I can see it. And I'm going to click on the drawing tools up at the top left. I've got three different options here. We've got radius tool, rectangle tool, and polygon tool. I'm going to use this rectangle tool because the area that I'm interested in right here is just right here. There we go. Now, what this has actually done, I'm going to scroll this all the way back up to the top. I see now that there's actually a new section of information that's been added above everything else that I've customized that refers to the map tools applied. Now, this rectangle that I'm seeing referenced here is actually this guy right here. And if I click on it, I can even name it if I want to. So for instance, if you guys do have a specific part of town that you're always working in, you can construct a search, save it, and it'll remember what that shape's name is. Now, if we want to run the search for this area, I can apply more criteria over here to the left, or I can actually hit this search function and it'll fill up the space with all the dots and add all of the properties that are in that area down here to the bottom. Now, let's actually run a search that's using just the map. Now, I mentioned before at the very beginning of class how there's some ways to actually customize this view. So let's say that I actually do have some plans to do some drawing on the map, but I don't need to add in any extra criteria. I actually know exactly where I'm searching, and I just want to get the results from that particular area as I define by my radius, rectangle, or polygon tool. Well, I need to clear this screen out from all of this extra interface that I no longer need. So I'm actually going to click on the button over here to the left. See, we've got our quick search, my search, and then there's this little arrow. If I hold my cursor over it, it says collapse search bar. When I click on that, it gets rid of the search function so that I can just click on the little magnifying glass up at the top left here. And if I want to make sure that the map is the only thing that I'm seeing on my screen, I can either click to move the list up or down, or I can actually just click on the map view, which just minimizes the list out of the way for me. Now, similarly, if I wanted to only see my results, I can switch back over to list, but I'm going to do that in a moment. Let's actually start doing my search. So I'm going to scroll over here. Let's actually grab some of the properties in this little area that's filled up with a bunch of cul-de-sacs, apparently. So I actually have a couple different options for how I can define my shape. Notice there's a little bit of a peculiar curve to this because we've got 46 that bends over there and there's maybe some railroad tracks. So it kind of all just kind of got wonky. Now we can do my rectangle tool, which is great, but there's a small problem. If I'm still trying to search in this particular area, but I don't want to include, maybe I'm assuming some businesses over in this spot, I can actually not make any major adjustments to this. I can adjust how large the rectangle is just by clicking and dragging the lines, but that's not really making the shape different. I'm still going to be stuck with that rectangle. So I'm going to delete this shape. I've got a radius tool, which at least allows me to click and drag, and I can maybe get a little bit closer to the shape that I'm looking for, but now I've accidentally added in some stuff over here next to Regency Park. So let's actually talk about the less straightforward option, the Polygon tool. Polygon tool is also a really handy option. The way this works is that you click in one spot, and notice it's actually added effectively a pin. Now, when I move my cursor, notice there's this faint blue line. When I click again, it adds another corner and takes that faint blue line and turns it into a solid blue line. Now I'm going to take my cursor. Again, notice there's that faint blue line that's following where my cursor is. As soon as I click, turns that into a corner. And again, click to turn it into a corner, corner, corner. There we go, give it a little bit of a curve there, and then pinch it off. Perfect. So now I've actually got a shape that's a little bit more customized. You can include more shapes on the map. So if you guys do end up wanting to have multiple areas selected, I believe you can add 5. Let's see. Yep, you can only do 5 shapes. Now, if I need to get rid of any shapes that I've added, again, just click on them, delete, 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 and we're good to go. Awesome. Now, once I've got my shape selected, the Polygon tool does allow us to make changes to this. If you remember, the radius tool and the rectangle tool only allowed me to make subtle changes to it, like how far away that edge is from the rest of the rectangle, how big the radius is. With the Polygon tool, I can actually change things on a segment by segment basis. So if I grab one of those dots in between, I can actually move that and it becomes an extra corner. Or I can actually grab a corner and move that around, and there's a lot less restrictions on how I'm actually making my shape since it's just a polygon. There we go. Now I'm set. So if there was any stuff that was over here and I didn't want to include that, I can just move everything into place and I'm good to go. Now there is one small caveat with doing the map search. When I click on search, what this is going to do is find any of the properties that have any overlap with the shape that I've drawn. Now, a perfect example of this is notice that it added in some dots because there was an edge of this particular set of properties, these 3 properties here, that actually have some overlap with my shape. I'm going to zoom in. Let's actually take a look at this. So it looks like, oh, yep, just that little sliver down the middle there that actually ended up getting overlapped. So what I'm going to do is actually restrict my search just a little bit closer to the properties that I'm interested in. And that way I don't end up accidentally including things I don't want. So the easy rule of thumb is, if I only want this particular property, notice the parcel lines are those little faint gray lines. The only thing that I need to add to my shape is just within those parcel lines. That way, whenever I'm running my search, I'm only going to find the property that I'm looking for. So for instance, again, if I only want these 3 properties on the edge here and not any of the properties in its vicinity, now when I run my search, I go back, I see that I've got 2 shapes applied, hit search, and it's going to only have these 3 properties here. And notice, because I drew my line in a little bit, it no longer has those properties. All right, now let's talk about our results. This is going to be a little bit brief since we're coming towards the end of class, but I'm going to switch this over. Again, I'm going to minimize my search function on the side. I want to take a look at some of the properties that are in this area. So I've got plenty of dots, and I guess I can click on some of these if I wanted to, but there's a lot of overlap, and I don't know what the addresses are at this point. So I'm going to switch over to my list view. So when I click on list, the list view, for some reason right now, Realist has this new card view that you can see. Doesn't it's nice, I guess. It'd be really nice if there were a lot of listings in the area so that these wouldn't just be little illustrations of houses, but photos of the properties themselves. Instead, what I'm going to do is actually switch it over from the list view up here at the top right corner, or the cards view, excuse me, to the list view, which is this guy right here, table view. There we go. Now the table view does have some customization to it. Just like when you guys are working in Matrix, you can click and drag these columns to rearrange them. So for instance, if you guys want to have all of the location details before the owner, you can modify it that way. Or you can actually go up to the Customize Table option, and there's an option right here that says Show Hide Columns. Now, just like we've seen so many other times in Realist, there is a Categories section on the left, checkboxes in the center, and selected attributes over on the right. If we check any checkboxes, we will run ourselves out after we've selected 30 items. But if you have things in here that you don't want, just click that little X to get rid of it, and you'll be good to go. Now, finally, let's talk about one more thing with the map. I'm going to clear my search out so that I don't have any shapes, I don't have any results. Let's go back to our map, and this is where we're going to spend the last couple minutes of class. So up here at the top of the map, we have a couple other options. These are going to be beyond what we're going to be using for searches. So what that means is that this is not going to be focused on any search functions anymore, finding results, emailing them, printing them, exporting them, making labels, all that stuff I'm going to be providing in some video tutorials included when we send out the recording. Now, at the top of the map, we have a bunch of extra buttons. Let's look at the map view itself over on the top right. We've got a road map view. That's actually what we're looking at right now. Notice all the streets are labeled. When I switch over to satellite view, this is really handy for me to see what's happening. Oh, yep, looks like there's a bunch of businesses, a railway that goes through there. All right. But this actually no longer has any of the street names. So if I do want to switch this over to a satellite view, I would recommend doing the hybrid view so that you can at least see all of the roads that are labeled on there. And then finally, we also have the terrain view, which of course isn't particularly useful depending on where you live, because as you guys can see, I don't see a lot of shading for ups and downs of hills because it's Oklahoma, so it's very flat. But not to worry, I can switch this back over to road map. I usually recommend people to stay on road map just simply because it's not very data intensive. We also have these buttons up at the top where we can add in whether there's parcel lines. I always recommend leaving that on there. And you'll notice that because that is checked, I see 1 out of 6 selected. I can add in zip code lines, city lines, county lines, school district lines, and even an overlay that shows us our flood map. Now, once I have all those checked, I see that I've got 6 out of 6 selected. And of course, it's way too much information. Now, because of that, you may end up wanting to limit yourself to just a couple pieces of information. Again, always leave parcels up on there. We'll occasionally get calls about that. But this way I'm seeing just the data that's useful. There is also an overview that allows us to choose whether we see any of the tax sales. You can even set this for the last 3 months, 6 months, so on. This is all dependent on when it was that the tax records were last updated. Same thing goes with MLS status. We've got active, pending, closed. We can just add these pins and it'll show us all the properties that have sold. Again, notice these checkboxes are actually indicating to us that we've added a certain number of elements. So there is a limit to how much you can add. Finally, we do have the options under this Trends tab. So that's actually this one right here. And we can see we've got this broken down either by sales price, the AVM, sales activity. Take some of these with a grain of salt though, because you may find a zip code that this has broken it down into, and you might see that the median sales price is way higher than other properties in the area. You can balance that out by taking a look at the sales activity to find out how many properties have actually moved in that area. So if you end up doing this median sales price and you find that the median sales price is maxed out at like over $500,000 for the median sales price, but it's in some tiny county or tiny zip code out in the middle of nowhere, go double check the sales activity because you might find that there's only one property that's sold. So that median is only based on one thing. You do have an option to do points of interest. Again, some of this information might not be up to date, so I usually don't show that off. We do have driving directions, which allows us to put in an address or a parcel number. So if you guys do have some property that doesn't even have a 911 address yet, just put in that parcel number and you'll be able to find your way there. And then finally, there is also an option to locate on map, which is actually pretty handy. If we type in an address, notice how it's actually automatically giving me some search results. And if I click on one of those results, it'll just zoom me on down to the spot and I can see where I am. All right. Well, beyond that, there are a couple extra features that I usually like to show you guys. Since this is a truncated version of the 3-hour class that we usually do when we're teaching Realist in person, I'm going to be sending you some of that information directly in email. We have some videos as well as some tutorials that Realist has actually released. I'll send you guys links to those. That's going to be covering how to export data as well as how to print off labels for properties that you've searched for. Beyond that, just remember that you guys do have the option to do a foreclosure query. Under the saved searches, just choose that other golden padlock icon, the foreclosure query. It has some really nice features in there. Uh, Strongly recommend exploring that. And just as you guys are probably aware, since we've been kind of messing around with a lot of stuff in here, this is not necessarily something that you're going to be able to break. In fact, if you guys end up finding that there's something that doesn't work in Realist, give us a call and let us know. But please get in here, play around with it, try and find out what it can do for you. And if you guys have any problems, questions, have some targeted usage that you're not seeming to be able to make sense of, give us a call over at the service desk and we can help you out. I'm going to go ahead and put our contact information up on the screen. There we go. And if you guys have any questions, we'll be leaving the session open for now. And hopefully I'll see you guys in future training.